Okay, well, I would like to write again. I've been feeling like writing again. And the reason I'm making this video is because I feel as if writing is an activity that emerges, for me it emerges when it just can't help itself but emerge. And I think that this applies to all sorts of other behaviors and motivations to do things. I suppose it's my attempt to try and bridge the gap between the duality of waiting for inspiration for something and just disciplining yourself to do something. And I think that the bridge for me is found in this weird sort of bubbling into existence thing. The need to write bubbles into existence, but it doesn't bubble into existence by me waiting for it, or not entirely because of that. It bubbles into existence also due to other activities that sort of lead me to it. Sort of like making videos in this case. That this is what happened last time I had a big impulse to write. I was just making a lot of videos, and it got to the point where my thoughts were becoming so difficult to organize on camera that I just needed to write notes for them. You know, as most YouTubers do, I suppose. But then the notes for the videos became so long that it almost made no sense to make a video out of it. It made more sense to just keep the note as a text in its own right. And I realized then that by writing, I could organize my thoughts in ways that I couldn't by just speaking out loud on a camera. But that's the funny thing, that it's almost as if the need or the desire to write emerged as a consequence of me having amped myself up through making videos to the point where there was a whole sort of series of ideas that wanted to be expressed. They wanted to be expressed because I had been making videos, but they couldn't be expressed through the videos. And this is something that I think applies to all sorts of other things. I've noticed in other kinds of art making scenarios and non-art making scenarios. Like, there are times when maybe I'm writing something, let's say, and it gets to a point where through the act of writing I stimulate like my visual imagination, and I'm writing about these visual landscapes or whatever, and I'm getting really into the visual aspect of it, so that through writing I'm stimulating that part, but then it gets to a point where it's as if that it bleeds out of the page and it wants me to draw again or something. It always leads you back to things that you haven't done in a long time and that seem to relate to your childhood. Like, drawing was something very important to me when I was a kid, and it's something I don't do very often these days, but it's almost as if by, you know, Joseph Campbell's idea of following your bliss sort of leads you to a place that you didn't expect to reach when you started following the bliss. So you follow whatever is blissful for you at that particular moment. It may be making videos, but then that leads you to write, and then writing leads you to draw. There are these sort of weird like transformations, as if the mode of expression you're in blossoms into another mode of expression. You know, and I wanted to highlight that aspect of it, that the desire to paint, for example, comes from the writing. So it doesn't feel as if the writing was a mistake. Like, oh, I should have been drawing this whole time. Because it's a loop that I think the ego very easily gets into. I've gotten into it a lot, where after a long period of doing one thing, I suddenly realized that, like, after a long period of writing, there is like an itch begins to grow, and you don't know what it is. You can't put a name on it, and then you realize, oh, it's an itch for drawing. I want to draw. And then once you realize that, you draw, and it feels as if, oh, wow, okay, so that was closer to what I wanted to do, right? It's almost as if all of the writing I'd been doing before was a delusion. The ego can get into this negative mindset where it feels as if you had just been drawing the whole time, it would have been better. That somehow the writing was just a detour, a form of repression, And I don't think that's entirely it. I think that, again, it's as if the desire to paint comes, it blooms through the writing, but then it sheds the writing. Really, the feeling of flowers blooming, or even just butterflies coming out of their cocoons and stuff like that, that the cocoon is not a prison. It's precisely the situation from which the butterfly emerges, so that I think maybe it's important to learn to honor and feel love for the stages that take you to the new stages, and to not just dismiss them all, I was thinking about this in relation to God. As I was saying in that video, it was a very quiet video. I don't know if it was very easy or comfortable to listen to, but I really felt like making it. And in that video, that night, I sort of connected a lot of dots with regards to God and faith and things like that, because I suddenly realized this thing that exactly, somehow, as you get closer to the epicenter of faith, or to the epicenter of faith, everything that had led you towards that experience is seen as valuable. And that's a strange thing, because while you're in a limbo state, it can sometimes feel as if there is such a thing as wasting time. Like going back to the writing and painting thing, you can say, oh, I wasted so many years of my life writing when I should have been a painter or whatever. But when you're in the epicenter of faith, it feels as if everything was a cocoon that led you to where you are now. So you feel thankful for everything that has happened before. Nothing feels like a waste of time. Nothing feels like a detour or like a mistake. And that is not to say that detours and mistakes don't exist. It's just that maybe we are so used to seeing things as detours and mistakes that having the faith perspective that everything was valuable is like it's a healing counterpart that you just want to bathe in for a while because it's healing, right? So, we've already developed a part of ourselves. It's very well developed through the culture we're in now, the part of ourselves that says that there is such a thing as evil, right? And it's a valuable part of ourselves, and it's good. It's a good thing to have, to think about such things as, irreversible damage, things going wrong and there being something bad about that, you know. We've acquired a lot of that ability to because that's a lot of what the world is, really. Things that's sort of a lot of what we focus on in culture. You know, you when you look at the news or something like that, and you kind of get that picture that there are, you know, choices that lead to tragedy. There are tragedies that are irreversible. There are, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So that the faith perspective is not an escape from that. It's just the counterpart to it. And because it's a counterpart that I am not used to being in, it's not a state of mind that I'm used to. Like, I'm much more kind of used to being in the cultural kind of perspective, that being in that faith perspective feels really healing. It doesn't feel like it's ignoring all of the knowledge that is acquired there. But of course, because it's a perspective that says almost the opposite, that says that there is no such thing as an irreversible tragedy, that everything is valuable, everything is good, and so on, it can feel as if it's erasing the knowledge of the other side, as if it's contradicting it, and is as if you should choose one or the other. You either choose the extremely optimistic perspective, or you choose the pessimistic perspective. I don't even know if I would call it pessimistic necessarily. I think that that's the problem. There is a realism to both sides, and so this whole issue of like inspiration, you know, making videos, writing, painting, whatever it may be, I think it has something to do with this, because you could almost say that it has really helped me to see the ways in which mistakes can be cocoons from which, you know, perfection can emerge. That's the problem with perfectionism, I think. That there's no problem, I think, with the ideal of perfection. I think that the problem maybe is to not appreciate everything that leads you to it. Because to not appreciate it is something like what in Buddhism is called attachment, I think. I've been thinking a lot about attachment. That let's go back to the example of, I've used this in a lot of recent videos, alcoholism, addictions in general. The person who has an extremely negative experience from abuse of alcohol and then rejects that experience entirely is very likely to start drinking again, right? It's almost like a meme. It's almost become a joke when you hear the phrase, you know, I'm never drinking again. It's usually, in pop culture and stuff, it's always used as a joke, as if to imply, you know, yeah, we've heard that before, you know. You have a terrible traumatic drinking experience, you say you'll never drink again, and then after some time, the desire arises again, and it leads you to exactly the same place, maybe even worse. And, you know, why does the desire to reject an experience make you bounce back towards it? I think it's because both in rejection and in obsession, there is attachment. When you're rejecting something, you're not actually getting rid of it. the word attachment already implies that, right? You're connected to it. That is to say, if you have such strong negative emotions to it, it doesn't matter if those emotions are positive or negative. It means you have very strong emotions towards it. And that keeps you connected to it somehow. That somehow, I've found that for me what works is to try and, yes, on the one hand, of course, you're trying to distance yourself from experiences that don't bring you happiness. But the way to distance yourself from them sometimes is to not have such a strong attachment to them. And yeah, to not have such a strong attachment to them, and therefore to allow them to go. It's like mourning almost. It's like mourning the death of someone, right? It's just sort of being able to let something go involves somehow experiencing your emotions for it fully or something. And therefore, it probably also implies a certain degree of self-respect or something like that. In that, you know, if it was your decision to get very drunk, then it's a decision that came from you. If you reject that decision 100%, and you say that was an evil decision, you're saying that there's something about you that is wrong. You know? So I think that, and that is precisely what can lead someone to drink themselves to death, is if they think that there's something within them that is wrong. I think that then precisely, paradoxically, in order to stop drinking, you have to somehow feel love and compassion for the part of yourself that feels that urge to drink so much, you know? So somehow, in order to stop drinking, you need to feel love for drinking. Love for the decision to drink, not necessarily for the experience. Love for the decision and where it comes from. It's you. You have to feel love for yourself. And so that sort of connects to the thing with perfectionism and waiting for inspiration and so on, because it almost feels as if with perfectionism, you spend a long time making art that later in hindsight feels like a mistake. Like, oh, that thing I made was terrible, or whatever. And you feel no love for the part of you that decided to take those artistic decisions. You're like, oh, all of those artistic decisions are wrong. Well, you're sort of feeling no love for that part of yourself. And that just won't lead you away from it. You know, if what you want is perfection, then perfection will... That's the thing. Perfection requires you to feel love for yourself. The mistake with what we call perfectionism, usually, I think, is that you just don't, you're always considering yourself to exist in the future version of yourself. You're always considering yourself to exist in the future version of yourself, and that everything that comes before it is wrong. It's basically it's one of the main ways in which religion is understood in our culture, right? That everything that comes before heaven is filth. You know, the material world is filth. Everything is a hellish world until you reach heaven. But the paradox is that, you know, when you actually look at religious texts, the Bible, whatever it may be, it's all full of sentences that contradict that. You know, the kingdom of heaven is within you, and so on. There are things that, in order to be in heaven, you need to feel love for what there is right now, to not feel attachment for it, right? So to not feel either excessive, desperate desire for, or desperate rejection of, but to feel sort of like an acceptance of at some level. And again, there are ways in which it's important to reject things. Like, that's the problem, that this doesn't mean that you need to be this sort of weirdly sort of like equalized person that feels no strong emotions. I think that it's the opposite of that. It's that precisely in order to feel strong emotions, you need to have little attachment, or that maybe in our cultural context, we have too much attachment. We need less attachment. In order to actually fulfill those emotions. You know, the case of violence is one example, that sometimes, you know, this happens a lot in movies and literature and stuff, where someone murders someone that brings great, someone really hates someone. They hate them passionately, and they kill them. And once they kill them, that hate still exists. And it almost becomes a tragedy that for themselves, it almost becomes a tragedy that they kill that person, because now they have no alchemical vessel with which to work with that hate. You know, they spend so much time acquiring that relationship with that person of hate that allowed them to work with hate. And now that person's gone, and all that hate just backfires and fries in weird ways. That paradoxically, in order for that hate to express itself fully, that it was probably better to not kill that person, and therefore to not feel such attachment to this particular configuration of the material world. And the same with positive things, that, again, I feel as if our culture understands renunciation in a very weird way. That is, that you need to, sort of equalize yourself, flatten yourself, not feel strong positive emotions, not feel strong negative emotions. That you need to not sort of not have anything that stands out. But I think that it's the opposite, because in fact, as I was saying, in so many cases, like in addiction and so on, the intense rejection of something just leads very easily to an intense backlash of it. I mean, just look at the way in which the church is associated to child abuse and so on, right? The intense rejection of sexuality and sexual desire as something sinful just completely backfires, right? And that therefore, if what the word renunciation or asceticism should mean, in my opinion, is something to do with attachment, then clearly that's not working. This intense rejection of it as something sinful, as, feeling no love for that part of yourself, that doesn't work. I think the idea would be to that paradoxically, and that's the thing that I think our culture doesn't fully understand, is that by reducing your attachment, you actually intensify the experience, but in a wholesome kind of way. That to how do I say this? I think that as in the case of violence, for example, I think that actually violence would express itself in a much more satisfactory way if there was less attachment. It's not that detachment reduces the experience. I think it actually just allows it to express itself more fully. And the same for things like sex and so on, that I think that having less attachment to sex, we think that having less attachment to sex means being a monk and not having sex. But I think that it's the opposite. That having less attachment to sex allows one to have a more satisfactory relationship to sex. The image that Freud mentions in his interpretation of dreams now comes to mind of that patient of his who, I can't remember how the story went. It's almost become just a meme at this point. The idea that there was a patient who smoked cigarettes in a way that seemed to sort of, there was a complex around that issue that connected to fellatio. And that it seemed as if the smoking of the cigarette was a substitute for the performing of fellatio. And that therefore, I'm back at the beginning of the video. There are two things going on here. On the one hand, there is a way in which I think perfectionism has a lot of truth to it, in that there are ways in this world in which you can be involved with things that you don't want to be involved with, or that you would rather be somewhere else. I mean, this is so basic that it's weird to know how to talk about it, right? That, there are ways in which the situations you're in are situations you would like to get out of and into more authentic situations that felt truer to you. I think this is the idea of heaven, right? So in this case, it's very likely, although, this is something only that patient could say, I can't really say it for them, but it would seem likely that they would want to perform fellatio, but felt ashamed of it, felt guilt towards it, or something like that, and that therefore you could say that they would prefer to be in a situation where the cigarette, as a euphemistic phallic symbol, transformed, again like a butterfly, into its authentic formulation, so that the experience of smoking cigarettes led you to the experience of sucking someone's dick, or whatever. That there's the same thing going on here as in the idea of text and painting, right? That imagine that you are sort of naturally inclined to paint, to draw, to work with visual imagery, but for some whole series of strange mechanisms that you don't fully understand, you have not engaged with the art with visual arts very much. Who knows, maybe there's all sorts of repressed traumas surrounding it. And so you go to writing, and you write and you write and you write, and then, in this case, it's as if writing would be like the cigarette. It's not exactly what you want to do, and you feel this sort of insatisfaction with the medium growing. And it's like the medium itself transforms into its new formulation, in this case, painting. That would be like one way in which it seems as if that would be like a healthy thing to happen, that the engagement with one manifestation, when that engagement is free of attachment, leads you to a more authentic form, right? The same with alcoholism, I think. And this is kind of, I think, what people like William Blake and Crowley are saying when they say things like, don't leave any desire unsatisfied, or, the fool who persists in folly becomes wise, and so on. That I think that it's that if you, for example, and this is something that I think happened to me, I think that the way I used drugs as a teenager, in this case, alcohol, but also weed, even light things like tea and coffee, the way I generally sort of related to, or food even, to things that were stimulating, but let's stick with alcohol because I think it's common enough, was, I think, in hindsight, in the same way that Freud's patient was smoking cigarettes when actually what they wanted was to have sex, I was drinking alcohol when actually what I wanted was to have a religious experience, or to be in contact with the divine, or with the divine side of life, or there was a sort of a religious component to it. I was sort of trying to drink my way into ecstasy. You know, I think a lot of people use alcohol in a social way, where for them the desire to drink stops when their social needs are met. So once everyone in the room is drunk and they're all having fun and they're all talking easily and there are less sort of inhibitions, that's the point where a lot of people stop drinking, because what they wanted wasn't to get drunk. This is something that took me a long time to understand, that I suddenly realized that most people who drink alcohol, again, most people who drink alcohol and are not alcoholics or don't have a problem with it, what they want isn't actually to get drunk. What they want is to be in society. That's what they want, right? When that exterior condition is met, that's good. That's like, it's the climax of the experience. But for me, it was the opposite. And I think for a lot of people who have problems with abuse of substances in general, I think have this problem probably, which is that the peak of the experience has nothing to do with society. In fact, it was almost the opposite. It's almost as if I didn't really care what other people were doing. I just wanted to reach that sort of weird pinnacle of bliss, which can't be reached with alcohol. At least that's sort of my intuition about it at the moment. I think that alcohol is probably good for all sorts of things, for social encounters. It's good even in a non-social way. But I'll get to that in a while, maybe. It's good for all sorts of things, probably. But I think that it's not good. Like, I think I was trying to get the kind of thing that you would more closely get with, like, LSD or mushrooms, right? Where you lie down and close your eyes and sort of dissolve into an experience. That was sort of what I was trying to get with alcohol. I think Terence McKenna even talks about this. It's the fact that alcohol is like the legal drug, which is available to everyone, means that any psychonaut, person with interests in psychedelia, is very liable to use alcohol as a substitute for psychedelics, and it doesn't work. You know, it's as if, because that imagined peak of perfection, of heaven, never arrives. What arrives before it is always a breakdown of the body. And I imagine that this is the same with just most non-psychedelic drugs, right? Heroin, cocaine, and things like that. So that's the thing that, you know, on the one hand, there's that in the same way that Freud's patient was using cigarettes to substitute sex, I think I was using, again, alcohol, but I think just general substances in general, food, all sorts of things, to somehow emulate religion. And so I think what William Blake is saying is that if you have love for that desire, if you honor that desire to drink alcohol, in this case, if you don't consider it a dirty sin that you should feel guilty about, which then leads you to drink even more, if you have love for that decision, then, at least this seems to have been what happened to me, it transitions into, it metamorphoses into its next stage, right? And the same for Freud's patient, presumably, right? That's the whole goal of psychoanalysis. Once there is some sort of a love or an integration of that desire, it transmutes into its next stage. This is, of course, something I think Jung was more capable of expressing or formulating in a way that's satisfactory to me, because it talks about the future-oriented aspect of psychoanalysis and the aspect of individuation and of things getting better. I think that Freud, from the little I know of him, is very focused not so much on how things can get better, but on how to prevent things from getting worse or something like that. Whereas Jung is more idealistic, and I think that there is that's the thing. There is a need to balance those two things. I think that pessimism needs optimism. They need each other somehow. Again, and when you realize that the word pessimism isn't even appropriate, and so on. But in any case, so I think that because of that, you can, things sort of transmute into their opposites. Yeah, like I said before, I think that there are ways in which alcohol or something like that can be used in a non-social environment. And that's something that I was very surprised by in my life, because I think that paradoxically, because I think this is not the case with a lot of alcoholics, where the only positive, I think that really the only positive experiences that have really stuck in my mind as being positive experiences with alcohol have been experiences in which I've drunk alone, but not out of sadness and desperation, but just like to relax or to sort of reading. I remember the few times that it has been 100% an enjoyable drug experience for me were times when I was reading. Paradoxically, not paradoxically, but it sort of speaks to what I was saying before. These were all experiences when I was reading spiritual kind of literature. So it's almost as if, the experience of the drug was kind of leading itself to its natural conclusion. Like, that's where I wanted it to be. I remember reading texts on Buddhism, drinking beer, and having like zero hungover, just absolutely just perfect kind of an experience. And so that to me was very mysterious, because I don't know how many people have experienced that. Whenever I tell people about that, about the fact that I once I got really drunk and I had no hangover. And I think it's because it was such a 100% positive experience. I was doing exactly what I wanted to do. I was alone reading books on Buddhism, which is exactly the kind of thing that would have made me want to drink alcohol in the first place, according to my hindsight. What I feel makes the experience of drunkenness bad for me is when you find yourself, when you're drunk, it's almost as if you become more vulnerable in a way. When people say you lose inhibitions, well, yes, of course, you lose inhibitions. That means that you become more vulnerable. So, for a lot of people, that's great, because that doesn't put them in danger in any way, psychologically, emotionally. But depending on what your situation is, being vulnerable can be a very bad thing, because you're more vulnerable to all sorts of emotional and psychological stuff that you usually are better able to protect yourself against. Like, all sorts of peer pressure and stuff like that, right? If you find yourself drunk in a social situation that is giving you social anxiety, then all of the causes of that anxiety just get intensified if you're more vulnerable to them. I think that for a lot of people, I think most people that I've met who are comfortable with alcohol are generally extroverted people who, they only drink in social circumstances that they feel comfortable in, which is a wise choice, and therefore, because they're comfortable in that situation, being vulnerable in it doesn't imply any kind of danger for them. Again, it's kind of like sex. It's kind of like having sex with your friends in a group environment emotionally, right? It's that if you really are in a comfortable, intimate relationship with that group of friends, then you can all be vulnerable with each other, and it can be a very healing experience. But again, like with sex, if you don't feel comfortable in that situation, then being vulnerable is just going to make things way worse. And that's the thing that I think Terence McKenna speaks to, that I think it's precisely those kind of people who don't feel comfortable with that kind of environment that will use alcohol simply because it's the legal drug, when maybe actually what they would want is a different kind of drug or a different kind of experience. As usual, this is sort of where some of my doubts about what Terence McKenna is saying come into play, because I think that, I have a relationship to the use of substance as such, no matter if it's a drug or not, that tends to be obsessive, religious in nature almost. And so I could very easily, I can see myself, luckily, hard psychedelics are something that I've only tried kind of tentatively. I've never fully delved into it. But I can imagine if I had sort of like, if I had access to a lot of strong psychedelic drugs, I can see myself ruining my life with them. Here, of course, it's very speculative, because I think that Terence McKenna would say, and he probably would have a good point, is that actually it's more difficult to do that than you think, maybe. That precisely the nature of the psychedelic experience, the fact that it's psychedelic, that it sort of shows you your mind more than alcohol does, means that it self-regulates, and that therefore, if you are abusing it, the experience tells you. This is something that alcohol doesn't do. Alcohol doesn't tell you if you're drinking too much, but the mushroom does. At least my few encounters with mushrooms showed this to me. The mushroom, it shows you what you're going through, and therefore you're constantly seeing what's going on. I think it's probably therefore much more difficult to take it as a pleasure drug in the way that one would take cocaine or something like that, right? But, I still have my doubts about that. I still think that I guess at this point it's just a doubt. I don't really know what else to say about it. But anyway, so yeah, kind of returning it to the issue of art and expressing yourself then. I've been showing these examples of, you first write, and if there is less attachment to the experience, it transmutes into what it wanted to become, which was paint in this example, right? And this is something that, again, in Freud's example, we can relate to this idea of, this patient is smoking cigarettes, and then that transmutes into its next stage when the experience is integrated or some sort of love is felt for it. And it's funny because that already shows the way in which the mechanism of dreams operates in waking life, right? Because what is smoking? Smoking is kind of a recurring dream. You could almost say that an addiction, a habit, is sort of like a recurring dream, a recurring aspect of a dream. Let's focus on addictions because we tend to think of addictions in a negative way, not habits. I don't think there's anything wrong about habits. So let's focus on, let's say, habits that you would like to kick or that you're not 100% satisfied with, right? Situations that you just find yourself in again and again. You're like, oh, I'm in this situation again. And you're like, how can I get out of this loop, right? So imagine that this patient finds themselves in this situation, right? That they're smoking, but they would like to exit this habit. This is the great failure of our culture, I think, that our culture thinks that addictions and habit and these kind of things are things that you need to get out of, as if they were sand pits or something. What do they call them? Those sinking sand things. What the fuck do you call them? Anyway, as if it's sort of like a trap. You get into this trap, so you go like left into the trap, and then you need to pull yourself out right in the opposite direction. Now, like I was saying at the beginning, I think there is some value in this perspective and this way of doing things. And it's something that culture is very good at. The idea of, irreversible mistakes. Things that are, no one will give you back the time you spent trapped in that place. It was just a mistake. It's a terrible thing. You were trapped in that addiction for 10 years, and then you come out of it. You have to come out the opposite direction and learn to heal from it. And there's just not much you can gain from that experience. You just need to learn to accept that there are some things that are just, that there is no healing and no meaning in them. Again, in a certain way and in moderation and in a non-absolutist kind of way, I think there is a lot of value to that perspective. Then that in itself kind of contradicts itself, because I'm saying that there is meaning and value in an experience that says that there is no meaning and value in things. But I think that's the point, that if you take it in a non-absolutist way, there is a way in which seeing the non-value in things, the tragedy in things, goes hand in hand with seeing the meaning of them. But in any case, I think this is something that our culture is absolutely convinced of, in a way that denies the possibility that when you get trapped in a trap, the way out is through. That actually, if you get trapped towards the left, you need to push even further towards the left. And I think that that's what happens, for example, in the case of the Freud patient with the cigarette. Freud patient with the cigarette doesn't need to recoil from the experience of smoking cigarettes. The experience of smoking cigarettes is symbolically trying to push a message into their face, right? The message is, you have a desire to suck dick, right? And it's showing that symbolically through the cigarette. If that patient pulls away from that experience, they are losing the opportunity to see that. They are losing the opportunity to see the symbolism of it. As in the person who kills their enemy and then loses the opportunity to work alchemically through that relationship, So that, and I'm not saying in all this that that you should stay in toxic situations in order to alchemically learn from them. No, I think that's the point. There is a difference between, you know, killing someone and saying goodbye to them and leaving and distancing yourself from them. I think that is, to me, seems like a healthier way of dealing with the alchemical process at hand there. But going back to the cigarette thing then, our culture would tend to see this, and this is probably why our culture doesn't trust psychoanalysis, is because our culture thinks that there is no way that I mean, to put it bluntly, it's just the issue of symbolic language, isn't it? It's just that the very fact that there could be a symbolic meaning in the act of smoking a cigarette seems so ridiculous to our culture. And the problem is that, you know, the reason it feels ridiculous is because in order for there to be a symbolic meaning in the act of smoking a cigarette, it would mean that, well, first of all, that symbolism and meaning are things that can emerge from the unconscious and that can organize themselves in ways that are more richly nuanced than the kinds of meaning that we are able to construct consciously. And so that is very uncomfortably close to the idea of God for our culture, right? Some sort of a self-organizing network of meaning that is more intelligent, more sort of able to craft complex meaning structures than we are able to. And you know, and think that that's precisely right? That is close to what we would call God, and that therefore, in the issue of psychoanalysis and in the study of the unconscious is the discovery of God, as Jung says. And that's the sort of weird thing. It's the weird sort of, you could almost see it historically as like this weird downfall of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis has its own downfall inscribed in it. Freud discovers this approach. Jung, in my opinion, and there are so many other people who did psychoanalysis, but I think that in the pop imagination, Freud and Jung are probably the two kind of big ones, I guess. It seems as if in order to, well, and Lacan, but yeah, that probably sort of spreads out in another direction. It seems as if in order to extend Freud, you need to take seriously the idea that there are forms of organized meaning that are more complicated than the ones that we are consciously able to produce. I think maybe even Lacan, like Slavoj Žižek, who seems to be one of the contemporary kind of most famous contemporary, what you would call them, proponents of Lacan or something. I've always found Žižek is kind of a mystic. He definitely doesn't consider that himself, but he talks about reality in these ways, right? He speaks, and I think that people find Žižek ridiculous precisely because of the same reasons that people would find Jung ridiculous, for example, that he's seeing structures of meaning in Hollywood movies and things like that, that he doesn't claim are conscious. In fact, he claims that they're unconscious, and yet he is claiming that they are extremely complicated and rich and nuanced. So he's already placing what we would usually consider intelligence as being something that there is more of in the unconscious than in the conscious mind. So that, again, already is so close to an idea of what we would call God. And so, in any case, it seems as if, therefore, when that patient, Freud's patient, is smoking cigarettes, there is a symbolic content there. And if that person becomes aware of that symbolic content and becomes aware of it with love, integrate it, to not to not cast it away from themselves, then it's kind of what people said, what alcoholics were experiencing with LSD in the 60s with LSD research. It's exactly the same, I think. From what the studies say, alcoholics who took LSD saw the symbolic way in which their ingesting of alcohol was symbolically all sorts of other things that they hadn't contemplated. Everyone says LSD is kind of like psychoanalysis. That they would take LSD and then they would realize that, oh, actually, I'm drinking alcohol because of this childhood trauma, or I'm drinking alcohol because actually I have a desire to kill myself that I'd never fully acknowledged. And they suddenly become aware of the different meanings that the practice of drinking alcohol has for them. And it's the very fact of seeing these meanings that transmutes the practice. And it's the same with the cigarette. When the meaning of the cigarette is present, then it's very likely that the smoking of the cigarette will drop away and give way to a more authentic form of expressing that desire. What Jung would call individuation, right? And so in that's so close to recurring dreams, isn't it? It's funny. It's almost as if we are stuck in these little loops. And sometimes we're stuck generationally in these loops, right? Trauma is carried across generationally, so that maybe many people in your family have found themselves constantly stuck in the same patterns of behavior, the same type of addictions. And so it kind of like at all sorts of different levels of complexity, these loops are carried out. And it's when, our culture says you should escape the loop. But the problem is that has a literal dimension to it, which culture is very well acquainted with, like I said, but it also has a symbolic dimension to it, which is that you should escape the loop is a symbol. As in, the sentence, I should escape the loop, is to be taken symbolically as well as literally. Yes, you should literally escape the loop, but the escaping of the loop is a symbolic act, because the word escape is here a metaphor. It shouldn't be taken 100% literally, because in order to escape, we tend to think of metaphors of movement and so on, but it's as if in order to escape, you need to remain to a certain degree. You need to sort of see what the loop is. You need to somehow understand it, integrate it, right? And that's so interesting because, well, it's kind of reminds me of Gnosticism. It's so funny how in Gnosticism there is this idea that salvation comes through gnosis. That's interesting to me. It's so akin to psychoanalysis that it's knowledge which saves you. It's not performing a specific series of actions. It's not being good or being evil. It's knowledge in the sense that there is meaning in the patterns that you find yourself in. And if you see the meaning of the patterns that you find yourself in, that liberates you from the attachment that you have towards those loops. Something like that. And so the well, yeah, I mean, psychoanalysis, as I was saying, this sort of applies to the whole issue of inspiration, right? So that maybe you're writing, and then slowly it transmutes into painting or whatever. And there is the possibility that painting, therefore, becomes a more authentic expression of your individuality than writing was, and that there is something more fulfilling and joyful about that in your case. And as I was saying, this doesn't apply just to art. I mean, the example of the cigarette shows it, that there is a way in which both dreams and waking life are operating, it seems, through this sort of mechanism, right? When in Buddhism would be called karma, and these loops of behavior you find yourself stuck in, that maybe you find yourself doing this thing repetitively that you don't enjoy, like drinking alcohol and getting too drunk, but it can be very subtle things too. Maybe you just constantly find yourself in the same situation again and again, very subtle kind of situations, and it's sort of, maybe it's useful to think about them in the same way as the cigarette fellatio example. It's like, what is this situation I'm in? What meaning could it have? And how could I perceive that meaning in order to integrate it and move away from it, but with love? Right? But of course, it's as if it seems that the only way that I've found that this seems to happen is through, therefore, you need to therefore read life symbolically, and that immediately enters into the realm of the religious or the shamanic, right? Synchronicity, seeing life symbolically. And so in order to do that, you need to escape the bounds of culture somehow. It's something that's not compatible with the way culture treats health. Again, as I was saying, culture treats health as something where you need to escape the problem, not push through it. Push through it is not, again, these are all words that need to be taken metaphorically, I think. We're not talking about pushing or escaping. It's a metaphor for something that doesn't involve movement through space. Because when you take it too literally, it can make you perform actual things in space that maybe are not useful for you. Like literally pushing. Maybe you just push your body so hard that you have a heart attack or something, when actually you need to push in a different sense. So it's difficult. It's hard to know how to convey these things to oneself. But also, as I was saying before, the important thing maybe to remember is that on the one hand, if you're writing and then writing leads you to painting, there is a way in which the painting is a more authentic form. It's like the writing was a cocoon and it leads you towards the butterfly. There's something good in that sort of idealism, that sort of future-oriented idealism of Jung, of saying that is, I want to get there. I want to get to heaven, which is in front of me, right? But it's as if that only works when put in conjunction with the other thing, which is not escaping the past, not going towards the future through escaping the past, but going towards the future by going into the past. You're going in both directions at the same time. That would be more of the Freudian thing. Feel love for your past. Your past is just as true an expression of yourself as your future is going to be. Your future is not going to be any better if you think that your past was a terrible existential mistake that you should erase from history, Only when you sort of feel love for your past can you exist or feel love in the present or in the future. And so these are just some things I've been thinking about. Thanks for listening.